cosmic source, the practical how the representative happens to I think that would try and make people
We just up there. Yeah. Now, explain to me again, you guys are like a very interesting, well, for those of us in natural construction, yeah, but it's essentially a shell line in Alberta and Washington.
One time we had a little wildcat.
My perspective, understand where Washington, that's possible. Try to navigate some of the corners. Well, it's definitely a dynamic environment. Really also when I do it, I'm also with you.
My brother is always he's a lawyer.
Alberta's a place where we have a lot of business, but it needs to trade out of the world, whether it's energy or otherwise. We don't have enough of the market at home. How constrained is your energy market from Australia? Yeah, that's our biggest problem.
And I work with
Regulatory access.
engineering for
Public opinion against the worst. Not in the British, but in BC. One of the constraints that the federal government is a ban on
not even allowed.
you had restrictions in the law for fracking. Right, no. It's getting a little bit of pushback because moving into shale gas, and that's I suppose between farming the land or renting the land or explorers. Yep.
Okay.
Some cases that there's gas in the water. Is there a pipeline south for you guys? Well, there's lots of pipelines south. The one big one that has been a real barrier is the Keystone. Right. It looks like it's going to be completed. Well, the regulatory, the presidential approval is they have to wait for the Nebraska port situation. And the question is, it's been in the pipeline, so to speak, for so long, but I think they have to go back and reconfirm their suppliers. But that's, yeah, that's, I think, still, that's a critical one for us because we don't have a lot of operating and refining capacity. New operators coming on, streamers full. Until this, defense in the Gulf Coast, before everybody's going to look at investing more. Gotta get it to the West Coast. Gulf Coast, yeah. But yeah, it doesn't keep me. It would be good West Coast. And to be frank, diversify. Quite a discount on our crude. How much of Canadian trade do you think marketed international by the U.S.? Well, it's interesting now because of course you didn't have a
So I'd like to welcome everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask everyone to please silence their cell phones, which I will do myself. And introducing today's event will be our Vice President and Special Counsel, Mr. Alan Kelly. We will have two keynote speakers, Paul Michael Wihbey and then Colonel Preston Maclachlan, who's a professor here. After that, we will have a 10-minute break, and then the expert panel can be seated. We will also, we have index cards on all of the seats, and if you have questions, the Q&A period, which will occur after the conclusion of the expert panel, we ask you to please write your questions, and we have two Daniel Morgan staff, assistant librarians. They are seated in the back. If you could please stand up, Kim Rector and Evan McDermott, and they will be collecting those from you if you pass them to the end of the aisles. Mr. Kelly?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome, guests and staff, to this symposium. I think it's unique. It brings together a lot of elements that we haven't heard before. Central to it is, of course, energy. And how this affects everyone is going to be exciting because it has huge implications for how I grew up thinking about the importance of geopolitics. And energy is wrapped all around that. So I'm sort of excited today about hearing our speakers, and I hope you enjoy the program. Thank you for coming. Frank?
Yes, I should have told you. My name is Frank Fletcher, Director of Lectures and Seminars, and today's conference is Forecasting Global Energy, Geopolitics, and Markets. Introducing the conference is the Dean of Daniel Morgan Graduate School, Dr. Stephen Meyer, who had a distinguished career with the Central Intelligence Agency and who was for a number of years on the faculty at National Defense University. Dr. Meyer.
Thank you, Frank, and to everybody here, greetings, warm welcome. We're very happy that you're here today. We're looking forward to this highly informative session because we have a gifted panel of experts who know the energy world better than most others. We are indeed fortunate enough to have them here. There are few issues as timely and important as geopolitics and energy. It is an arena of many moving parts. The wide variety of sources and resources, oil, gas, nuclear, solar, wind, to name just a few, new extraction techniques that have realigned markets, powerful economic and financial forces that ebb and flow as the market changes, government intervention and public policy, heavy political and security implications, and important environmental considerations. Today, we face issues of low oil prices compared with just a few years ago, the impact of those lower prices on the Russian economy and Russian security behavior, the growing self-sufficiency of North American oil and gas, and just how long will that last? The rise and fall of proposed new gas lines, whether to build new nuclear power plants such as South Stream or Nabucco that come and go. The rise and fall of proposed new gas pipelines, how much to invest in clean energy, clean and renewable energy. Can clean and renewable energy be economically competitive and command the political support necessary to be a major force? How much has Fukushima and the cost damaged the prospect of nuclear energy? What impact would another war in the Middle East have on oil and gas recovery and prices? And how does all of this impact our national security? I'm sure our distinguished panel not only will wrestle with these issues, but will help us to come to terms with them. So I'm looking forward to this morning and for a lively and informative engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize also a guest today, the president of the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, who's made all of this possible. And we're very grateful to her. and to her daughter, who's the chair of our board, Abby Moffett, who could not be with us today. The first keynote, our keynote speaker, will be Paul Michael Wihbey, who's had also a distinguished career in the oil and gas sector. He's also a professor at the University of Port Harcourt in Nigeria. Please join me in welcoming Paul Michael Wihbey.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning, and thank you for the introductions to this event. Thank you to Dean Myers, Vice President and General Counsel Alan Kelly, and a very special thank you indeed to the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation and its board, American patriots all, who initiated, maintained, and sustained the idea of a graduate school of national security, the graduate school being, of course, Daniel Morgan Graduate School. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you. The presentation I would like to make for your consideration deals obviously with energy, geopolitics, and U.S. national security. And I'd like to start by establishing a historical context. December 7, 1941, September 11, 2001, illegal mass immigration from 2000, and the 1973 to 1974 Arab oil embargo. Each of these extraordinary historical events presented a fundamental challenge to the status, integrity, and credibility of U.S. national sovereignty. I term it the soft underbelly of U.S. national sovereignty. In all cases, those events were unprecedented and intrusive into the national security framework for the United States. In each of the first three instances that I mentioned, the government of the United States, expressing the political will of its people, responded to each crisis at the very highest levels with a choice of its own making. However, such has not been the case with the impact, effects, and geopolitical fallout arising from the 1973 oil embargo. As a consequence, for over 40 years, U.S. national security calculations, planning, and decision-making has been effectively compromised, impacting in the most profound and consequential ways U.S. military, foreign, and economic policies around the globe. As such, the purpose of this presentation is to present a somewhat subjective account of this period, which I have divided into three eras or historical periods, and they represent a de facto national security complex of calculations and decision-making, which I have categorized here during the periods that I break down as NSES-1, NSES-2, and NSES-3, National Security Energy Strategies. The first being the period from 1973 to 2015, which I term accommodation. The second, 1992 to 2016, alternative. And finally, to the present, the America First category, which has implications beyond the political slogan that we're familiar with. And to be as concise as possible, I've summarized the key characteristics of these three regimes in a categorized and comparative format, which you'll see as we move through the slides. And when I mention the soft underbelly of U.S. national sovereignty, or the compromise to the integrity of U.S. national security planning, I believe these charges can be quantified, and that there is empirical data to substantiate those charges. But first, the most obvious is the financial payout that the United States has paid to oil producers over a period of time. So from the period of 2000 to 2017, unadjusted numbers by U.S. Census Bureau indicates the United States has paid out over $2 trillion. When you adjust for inflation, that figure probably approaches $2.5 trillion. Taking in the numbers from 1974 to 2000, in all probability, the approximate payout by the United States is between $4 to $4.5 trillion. Add to that the cost of military deployment in the Persian Gulf and other areas of the Middle East to protect the sea lanes that carry crude and natural gas, LNG, around the world, the cost of military interventions of one form or another, including the war on terror, FMS and security assistance packages that run into the hundreds of billions of dollars. All taken together represent a massive breach into the edifice of U.S. national sovereignty that has not been repaired, and that only in 2017 and this year are we beginning to see the rehabilitation of national sovereignty and the integrity of American decision-making as it pertains to energy security and foreign and military policies related to energy. As I mentioned, what I've done is to try and categorize the key characteristics of each of these three periods. So very quickly, we're going to run through these three regimes. The first one being accommodation. Now, it was institutionalized in terms of a power structure, and when I mention institutionalization, what am I talking about? In terms of a de facto policy paradigm. Official government declarations, government regulations, taxation policy, foreign and diplomatic initiatives, military deployment, the establishment of bases, the formation and formalization of new alliances around the world that deal with energy issues in one form or another. So accommodation. The orientation here from the national security perspective was pragmatic. It was a recognition throughout this entire period that the United States had no choice, no alternative, except to accommodate to the requirements and needs of the suppliers of energy to allow the American economy to maintain itself. The overriding national security objectives during this period maintain U.S. economy with sufficient supply at all costs, and never allow another oil embargo to take place. Because if you recall, during that oil embargo period, the United States entered a deep recession, inflation, price controls, gasoline shortages. It affected the standing of the dollar. The Israelis withdrew from Sinai in January 1974, not because the United States wanted the Israelis to withdraw, but because the United States had to do it in order to appease and accommodate oil producers who had placed the embargo on this country. And that, in and of itself, is a classic example of U.S. geopolitics being compromised to meet the objectives of foreign powers. The operational assumptions, which lasted up until recently, were scarcity of supplies, higher prices and increasing imports into the U.S., and the notion of unreliable suppliers. In other words, producers and suppliers who could manipulate the flow at any point in time to meet their own national security and geopolitical and economic objectives. And there is no judgment on this issue. There is no political or ideological judgment. These are the hard choices, the difficult choices, the unpopular choices that national security planners face on a daily basis, including as we witness now with North Korea. And that's why I'm very grateful that there is an institution like a Daniel Morgan Graduate School of National Security, so students can be trained and educated to deal with the most complex and most profound issues facing this country. Here's a graph that shows from the period from 2000 to 2016, gross imports of crude oil into the United States, both from OPEC and non-OPEC countries. You'll see Saudi Arabia as the major OPEC supplier of crude into the United States. And on the other side, very interestingly, you'll see the Canadians supplying increasingly since 2000 and the development of the great oil sands in northern Alberta, Canada supplying a very large quantity of crude to the United States. And there's a reason for that as it relates to U.S. national security. Here's another graph that we can look at. The top one in green represents U.S. Imports of crude oil and petroleum products since 1980. The center line is from OPEC countries overall, and at the bottom you'll see Persian Gulf countries. And these are very significant numbers in the hundreds of millions of barrels per year. Now, to substantiate my contention on the qualitative nature of these national security energy strategies, I've taken the liberty and identified what I call national security directive and priority statements, which identify this period clearly from the highest levels of authority in the United States government. So here you see the Carter Doctrine clearly expressing the issues I have just presented to you, where President Carter at the State of the Union says, let our position be absolutely clear. Any attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States. And of course, underlying that, implicit in that, is oil and oil supplies, and the need to maintain those supplies and never allow another oil embargo to take effect against the United States. Then George W. Bush in 2000, very straightforward, very honest statement at the State of the Union. We have a serious problem. America is addicted to oil, which is often imported from unstable parts of the world. And that's a clear reflection, in my opinion, of the operational assumptions I just spoke to you about. And it's a reflection, almost an appeal, a lamentation by the President of the United States to the American public saying, we have no choice. We are addicted, unfortunately. But that's a reality, and that's what we as a government must deal with. During this period of time, again, in my estimation, the lead agencies in dealing with energy security matters at a global level were State Department and CIA. Because the viewpoint from Washington was not a US-centric perspective, but an OPEC-centric view. And this perspective was embedded within the institutions of official Washington for this period of time from 1974 to 2015. In policy institutes and agencies of government, NGOs, the media, and so forth. And it structured itself as a power structure. The elements of power, they have not dissipated. They're residual maybe, but they're still active and pursuing the particular agenda of this first regime that I'm talking about. And here you see some of the points that I've made to you. There was a shift in the global balance of power to OPEC, and particularly to Saudi Arabia, which set the market, not just in energy, but a multi-sector global phenomenon, dealing with sectors like transportation, of course, utilities of one form or another. Saudi Arabia became the swing producer. It helped establish monetary policy in the United States as a consequence through the recycling of the petrodollar phenomenon. So throughout this period, it was categorized in terms of U.S. national security planning. We had diplomatic initiatives wherein the U.S. became the security guarantor of Saudi Arabia and other states through a special relationship and the support and the formation of the GCC in the Persian Gulf. Militarily, yes, numerous naval and other deployments, establishing bases, FMS, and so forth. Political shared objectives between major OPEC players and the United States in various regions and countries, including Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon. And of course, one of the more key, but underreported issues is monetary policy and the impact that this period has had on the United States dollar as the reserve currency of the world, which is now to be challenged as a consequence of changes in global energy geopolitics. And we'll try and talk about that within a few minutes. Again, from a national security perspective, what was the most important domestic contribution to national security planning and policy formulation? I would argue it was the role of IOCs, international oil companies, many of them American, Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, Conoco, and of course Shell and BP and Total, who we've come to know as big oil. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting to note the Congressional Research Study in 2012 came to the conclusion that big oil, the American big oil companies, gross revenue on a yearly basis in 2011 equaled 10% of US GDP. Now, if you're looking at planning global policies taking into account energy issues of one form or another, that's a very important factor. Another important factor was the role of these companies, don't forget these are American companies, international companies representing their home nations or host nations. They were not obligated to the Persian Gulf necessarily, no. But they went out to find new sources of oil and natural gas in the hopes of diversifying supply, which in the case of the United States was very important to find remedy to the control that OPEC producers had over the United States, starting with the oil embargo. And one of the areas where they succeeded in finding new, reliable, and secure supplies was in Canada, investing heavily in new technologies for the development of the Canadian oil sands in northern Alberta. And as a consequence of that, Canada, over the 2000s, became our largest and most reliable supplier of crude. Now, moving forward into a more recent period, the National Security Energy Strategy 2, which I've dubbed alternative, fairly logical. The orientation is utopian. And the historical period, as opposed to the first National Security Energy Strategy, is post-Cold War, where the first was Cold War. So we're in post-Cold War period, and we have a peace dividend. And we have an opportunity to break away from the reliance on foreign oil. But take note, the operational assumptions at a national security level, in my opinion, are the same as the first. Scarcity of supply, high prices increasing imports, and unreliable suppliers. The issue here is to find an alternative to fossil fuels. And the approach, as we'll see in the next slide, is not OPEC-centric. It's something else, and it's not US-centric either. And the overriding objective: identify, promote, and support alternative energy sources, which can include renewables, solar and wind and hydro, biomass, battery technology, geothermal. And in the process, reduce or eliminate fossil fuels, crude, oil, gas, coal, from the US energy basket. So when Hillary Clinton, in the run-up to the election, famously or infamously said, we're going to put the coal miners out of work, that was simply a logical extension of this policy orientation on energy security. And all of this was to be assimilated and formalized in treaty, in a global governance economic model, which we've come to know as the Paris Climate Accords. In other words, the Paris Climate Accords were the culmination of this 20 or 25-year period of advancing an alternative approach to the use of fossil fuels in reaction not only to the Arab oil embargo, but also in reaction to what advocates of this approach perceived as the excesses of big oil and environmental degradation, and the excesses of misplaced or misguided U.S. foreign and military policies throughout the greater Middle East region. Again, these are my selections for the national security directives or policy statements. President Obama, in his presidential memorandum of September 21, 2016, wrote, "Climate change poses a significant and growing threat to national security, both at home and abroad. Climate change and its associated impacts affect economic prosperity, public health and safety, and international stability." Secretary of State John Kerry expounded on that the year before when he said, "The reason I made climate change a priority is not simply because climate change is bad for the environment. It's because by fueling extreme weather events, undermining our military readiness, exacerbating conflicts around the world, climate change is a threat to the security of the United States and indeed to the security and civility of countries everywhere." So I think that's a clear and concise statement of intent, where the U.S. national security posture is linked to and identified with environmentalism, climate change, and the need to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. But just to go back a bit here, I have in italics a little note that we had an overlap of at least 8 years between these two national security energy strategies, wherein they came not only into competition intellectually, ideationally, but also into confrontation. I'm going to make mention about that in just a moment. So under this regime, the lead agencies, in my opinion, were the White House, EPA, and State Department. And the operational perspective, as I mentioned earlier, is not OPEC-centric, and it's not America-centric or US-centric, it's Eurocentric. Because the concepts and the ideas were generated from the Club of Rome and the Limits to Growth and the World Economic Forum and Davos, and studies and initiatives from the UN. And the solution to limited resources required international collaborative effort, shared sovereignty on some of these issues. And instead of setting the market based on swing producers, dealing with the fundamentals of supply and demand in the oil market, we have setting the markets using cap and trade and carbon tax and other instruments. And that's why I say the orientation here is utopian as opposed to pragmatic. And the new technologies here, wind and solars and electrical vehicles and batteries and plasma. Innovative technologies indeed, but not driven so much by market innovation as government research, development, and commercialization back into the market, sustained and supported with robust subsidies. And that gives rise to questions as to the sustainability of these alternative energy technologies. Obviously, some will succeed in ways that we cannot anticipate. Some already have sustainable niche markets. Electrical vehicles are the rage right now. But let me show you a couple of charts. You can make your own conclusions. You can deduce from these charts the risks involved with new technologies initiated and developed by government as opposed to the private sector. Two of the key ingredients in batteries are cobalt and lithium. So take a gander, if you will, at the price increase of this particular commodity. And what does that tell you? What does that tell you in terms of the costs eventually relating to battery technology? And will it be passed on to the consumer? And will the consumer be able to afford? And cobalt, 2/3 of cobalt in the world is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Katanga province, which, according to multiple reports, is mined by child laborers. Lithium, just in the last few months. How high can it go? And who will be able to afford it? So I just raise these questions. Okay. Now we come to America first. And here the orientation, in my opinion, is neither pragmatic nor utopian, but utilitarian. The historical context is economic nationalism versus economic globalism. Now we have a total reversal of the operational assumptions. Instead of scarcity, we have an abundance of petroleum supplies. Oil sands, oil shale, offshore. We have reserves in Canada, Venezuela, Colombia, Russia, Nigeria, that would boggle your mind if you knew what the facts were in terms of those reserve numbers. The supply of oil and natural gas that can be extracted with profit will last us 100, 200, 500 years, without question. As a consequence, because of oversupply, and because speculation in the market is dying, speculation kept prices artificially high for a number of years. But you can't speculate when there's oversupply, when it's obvious, when you can't manipulate the numbers to fool a buyer. And now this new regime is characterized by low oil and natural gas prices. And instead of imports, the United States is exporting. It's exporting because the ban on U.S. oil exports that was imposed in the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo in 1975 was lifted in December 2016 as a result of a compromise deal between the Republicans and the Democrats on major spending bills. The Dems thought they got a good deal because they assumed they would win the next general election and could reverse the concession made to allow for crude oil exports. Obviously, that did not happen. And so what we have today is the United States exporting natural gas via pipe, especially to Mexico, LNG, and you'll hear a discussion about that shortly, and crude oil supply, still at the genesis of that phenomenon. This has massive implications on geopolitics, on national security, and domestic economic and financial matters. The overriding national security objectives in this period, which is officializing in 2017 because of the election of the Trump administration. It was formulating itself 2009 with the development of shale technologies. Horizontal drilling, pressure pumping, laterals, breaking into geological zones that no one's ever heard of. The Marcellus, the Bakken, Eagle Ford. I'll show you a map of that in just a second. And this technology, combined with the relatively accessible geology that this country is blessed with, allows now for the massive production of shale oil and gas that Goldman Sachs says will exceed 12 million barrels a day by the early 2020s. 12 million barrels a day. Saudi Arabia doesn't produce 10 million barrels a day, hardly. So the overriding national security objectives: restore national sovereignty, using domestic oil and gas production and exports via, and here's where government can facilitate, shape the market, not set the market, shape the market, via deregulation, devolution, tax reform, corporate tax reform in particular, and judicial appointments. And obviously the withdrawal, the decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, which totally separates this regime from the second. Here's the map. These are the operating areas of shale oil and shale gas, including up in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and parts of western Maryland. So if you have some acreage up in Maryland, you may have some shale in your backyard. And out west in Colorado, in Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, Montana, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana. And we're just at the very early stages. This represents the elements of national security planning and operation. These are the elements of national power. Because through this, exports can be destined for a variety of countries who are friends and allies of the United States, who need that supply. Through this, the United States secures low energy costs, lower gasoline prices, lower heating bills. It's the incentive for domestic and foreign investment in the United States, because you want to invest where you can access cheap, reliable, bountiful supplies of energy. And here it is. Thanks to technology, thanks to the creative and visionary work of a lot of people that no one's ever heard of when you talk about oil and gas. Here you see the escalating production of shale in some of these basins from 2007, 2009 up to 2017. And that's how I established a chronology for this new regime. North Dakota producing half of what Kuwait produces. Who ever heard of North Dakota as a major oil producer? Well, there you go. Oil and gas. The bars are oil production, and natural gas is the trending line upwards. Now, this is the National Security Directive priority or statement that I'd like to use. Now, this is from Secretary of Energy Rick Perry. This is July 2017. And Rick Perry also is a member of the National Security Council. So I'd like to, I won't read it out, but you can read it. I'll take a moment and I'll let you glance at that. I think it's self-explanatory. And you can see the geopolitical subset that permeates this statement. The lead agencies during this period, and I'm thinking we're going to wrap up shortly, is, in my opinion, the Department of Defense, and particularly the combatant commanders and DOE. And the orientation here, the perspective, is neither OPEC-centric, neither Eurocentric, but US-centric. This is America first. And this could evolve shortly into continental-centric, with Canada, possibly with Mexico, and a continental energy integrated grid system. As a consequence, the U.S. gains freedom of maneuver, as is no longer dependent on OPEC or Persian Gulf supplies. U.S. gains freedom of maneuver in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf area at diplomatic, military, and political levels. So the qualitative nature of our national security policies changes dramatically, and that's why I mentioned earlier that it's the combatant commanders on the ground, on the scenes, who, in my opinion, will be most influential in determining these geopolitical developments on behalf of the United States government. So here in this case, it's not the Saudis who set the market, but it will be the United States, along with selected allies to be determined. This allows the United States to better prepare a full spectrum array of contingencies to deal with these new conditions. Here in Riyadh, President Trump was very explicit in what he said, and just to paraphrase him, he can be quoted saying to the assembly in Riyadh, the United States no longer makes the choice for you in terms of your future. You cannot rely on us. You, Arab states, must make a choice to determine your national security futures. That statement in May of this year, in my opinion, marked the end, the termination of the most pivotal aspect of the first national security energy strategy, which was U.S. security guarantees for Saudi Arabia and other states. I believe President Trump's statement removes, in that declaration, the notion of security, U.S. as security guarantor for these states. It's a profound and consequential statement by the President, which deserves further study and evaluation. And finally, why America first? Because this is not the era of big oil. This is not the era of Exxon and Shell. This is the era of companies like EOG Resources, Continental Resources, Cheniere LNG, Kinder Morgan Pipeline, in which George Soros and Warren Buffett have invested heavily. This is the era of devolution. The localized producers, small and medium size in Texas and North Dakota, have taken the lead in developing this massive new production of U.S. oil and natural gas. They're not involved in global issues. They're not found in other places of the world. These are purely American companies operating in the United States, using innovative technologies, and allowing the United States to finally, I'm going to end here, to finally begin the process of recouping its national sovereignty and establishing the integrity of national security planning for the first time in 4 decades. So with that, I want to thank you very much, and I'll give it to Frank. Thank you.
Well, I think that having described the global geopolitical energy situation, I think we could agree that Mr. Wihbey has made the case that it is a brave new world order of oil and gas. The next speaker will be Colonel Preston Maclachlan, retired from the Marine Corps. He is a professor of military strategy here, and the title of his lecture is The National and International Security Implications of the Global Energy Situation. And his remarks are meant to bridge Mr. Wihbey's remarks and set the path to the expert panel. Please join me in welcoming Colonel Maclachlan.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're glad to have you here today, distinguished guest, faculty, staff, and administration. We're very grateful for you to be here today for this presentation. When Paul, Michael, and I were discussing this conference a couple of months ago, probably about 2 months ago, one of the things we talked about was a nation's energy policy may have a direct intersection with its national security policies based on their national interests, national values. It's such an important topic that in the Introduction to National Security course, one of the 14-week lessons is on energy and national security. So that's how serious we take it here. So today what we're going to do is kind of set the context for the intersection of national energy policy and national security or international security policies, and expose you to like 3 historical examples and then 2 current hot spots that may not be on your radar right now. So the 3 examples we're going to talk about today historically was the oil crisis, Operation Earnest Will, and then Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And then we'll move into current issues in regards to Venezuela and Nigeria. I took this directly from the Department of State History website. I think it kind of gives you a good understanding of what the current feel was at the time. You know, we had always been a strong ally of Israel, and in a moment of need, we were reaching out to them to support them, and the OPEC countries were not happy with this. And so we had the huge oil crisis, which really made the country sit there and think across the board, what do we need to do in order to prevent this in the future? Summer of 1987, I was in Charleston, South Carolina on a security mission in a naval shipyard. And I saw a gray bottom amphib ship drive up and pick up 6 minesweepers and put them on her front deck. And they brought these minesweepers out to the Persian Gulf as part of Operation Earnest Will. Iran and Iraq had been at war since 1980, right after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. They had a stalemate in the Al-Faw Peninsula. So the Iraqis, who were being supported by the U.S. at that time, were going after the Iranian oil refineries, like in Kharg Island. So the Kuwaitis and several other of our allies and folks who were oil-producing countries were concerned about getting the world's oil supplies out through the Straits of Hormuz to the markets that needed it. So the United States did this operation through 7th Fleet, which was based out of Japan at the time. And they said, okay, we can escort U.S. vessels So a lot of the tankers were reflagged as U.S. vessels in order to do this. To show you how large and huge a oil tanker is, over here in the bottom corner on the left-hand side of the screen was the Stena Explorer, which did not sink when it hit a mine. But a lot of smaller vessels in the Persian Gulf were vulnerable, to include combatants, warships in the Gulf, which meant that we had to step up our game in the Persian Gulf at that time. There were two other operations that were planned with Ernest Will. One was called Prime Chance, and the other one was called Praying Mantis. And it involved Special Operations Command, bringing in assets such as Night Stalkers out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, which is a Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and Naval Special Warfare Group. And what they did is they found the Iranian Revolutionary Guards were dropping mines in the Persian Gulf. So it was an operation to try and contain and prevent that and allow the free access of oil through the Straits of Hormuz. During the Reagan administration, the National Security Council, under the supervision of then Vice President George Bush, they started looking at the Middle East as a problem set because of energy issues. So they were kind of the impetus behind Ernest Will and a lot of the other things we were doing. But as the Iran and Iraq war wound down, Iraq had $10 billion in debt. And they were looking for relief from that debt from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and accused Kuwaitis of stealing oil from their Mala oil fields across the border. So they gave ultimatums. We noticed a massing of troops, and then eventually we had the invasion of Kuwait. I remember sitting in Fort Knox, Kentucky in May of 1990, hearing Colonel Harry Summers, strategist, CNN news consultant, and author of Own Strategy, A Critical Analysis of the Vietnam War. He looked at us in the audience and said, okay, Cold War is over, the wall's down, we just had Panama, had these other events, but he goes, what's going to happen if Iraq crosses borders and goes to try and seize 90% of the oil in the world at this time? So he predicted it in May of 1990 before it even happened. So one of the hot spots we've been following lately is Venezuela. And Venezuela has long been a supplier of heavy crude up through the Gulf of Mexico into the American markets. Right now they are falling on hard times. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see several of their oil and gas fields. So what has happened in Venezuela is that the government of the time with Hugo Chavez completely changed the economy in Venezuela. He based most of the economy on high oil prices at the time. So when he died of cancer, his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, has now inherited this economy. And what has happened is, through mismanagement and also being beholden to several different patrons, like if you look on here, you'll see Maduro meeting with Vladimir Putin, meeting with Raul Castro, and then up below his picture, you see his current vice president, which is Tariq Assimi, whose family is originally from Lebanon. So right now, Venezuela has very close ties or relationships with Cuba, with Russia, with Iran, and they also have a bloc in South America called ALBA of like-minded socialist countries, kind of a bloc. Unfortunately, what's happened is now there's a humanitarian crisis. Most people can't work, they can't eat, there's high inflation, and a lot of the neighbors are starting to receive a lot of the humanitarian crisis flowing across the borders. Just to show you how close things are, the U.S. is a Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean basin nation. And a lot of that crude was going to these refineries right here. This is a BBC slide that I pulled from the news about 2 weeks ago, just to show you how close we are in relationship and how far those ties go back with that industry. When those refineries close, you do notice a jump in prices. But also with our neighbors in Mexico and Canada, we're very fortunate here in North America because we can also reach out for assistance. So the big issue is, what is the tipping point in Venezuela? The current administration increases diplomatic pressure and economic pressure on Venezuela. They just put sanctions against the national company, Petroleum de Venezuela, so that they cannot sell off their debt here in the United States. But it has effects on other countries. For example, China will not really loan them money anymore. They know they're a bad credit risk. Citibank last year, I think, also backed out on them, and Coca-Cola. So it's going to be a huge crisis humanitarian-wise. And again, these are the oil fields from their national company up there on the map. The United States does not want to be seen in the region as gunboat diplomacy, the way we used to do things in South America. So it's kind of a tightrope for any administration. And I think this administration is taking a very good path, and I think it's probably because General Kelly is a chief of staff in the White House, is a former Southcom commander, and he understands Venezuela very well. So, I think we're probably looking for partners to deal with a potential humanitarian crisis and collapse. And who would those partners be? I think they're the affected countries right there in the region, such as Colombia and Brazil. Another country you probably should keep an eye on is Nigeria, and this is directly from the AFRICOM website. Nigeria has a lot of oil reserves. They're very blessed in that area, but it's a huge governance problem. Current President Muhammadu Buhari, he had been president previously in a coup d'etat and had also been involved in 2 or 3 other coup d'etats previously. He is walking a tightrope because right now the current population tracker says 192 million in Nigeria with 392 different ethnic groups. So it's a very, very hard place to govern. A lot of corruption in the government, problems such as the central bank printing money to keep the government propped up. And also there was a civil war there after independence with an area called Biafra. And there's talks of folks in that region that are not happy with the government as well right now. So he's walking a tightrope. And he's also dealing with this little problem called Boko Haram, which is up in the northern region of the country near Lake Chad. So the United States, through AFRICOM, is working to assist them in this problem with Boko Haram. And Admiral Howard from Naval Forces Europe and Africa was just in Nigeria talking about cooperation in the Gulf of Guinea, where you have piracy, kidnappings, other criminal activity that's aimed at the oil industry. So hopefully the president can hang on. He's had medical issues, so we're looking for hopefully a smooth transition of power. But this is kind of what the watch is for. How can we continue as partners and help them move forward? So today's problems are a lot more complex than they were 40 years ago. Fortunately, some of the energy policies we are now pursuing may give us a little bit more freedom of movement in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my remarks, and I'd like to turn it back over to Mr. Frank Fletcher.
Now we'll take a 10-minute break and be back in exactly 10 minutes. We'll then we'll impanel the expert panel. And we also, you'll notice your seats had surveys. And so before you leave today, if you have the time, please fill one out. That will be very helpful to us in continuous improvement of our lecture series. So please, let's have a break now. And lunch will be after the expert panel.
Frank, what's the, is there an order you want us in?
Well, Framing the Future, Energy, Economy, Technology, and International Politics. I'd like to remind everyone that we have index cards that should be on or near your seat and pens. If you have any questions, we have Kim Rector and Evan McDermott, two assistant librarians. They will be collecting your questions. At the conclusion of the expert panel, I will provide those questions to Dr. Sharnoff and he will read them. We won't be passing a microphone or taking questions from the floor. We wanted to make it easier on everyone. So if you have questions, the Q&A period will be the last 15 minutes of this session, which is slated to end about 12:15. So write your questions down and they will collect them and they will be posed for the panel by Dr. Sharnoff. Introducing the particular speakers for today, our distinguished panel is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Michael Sharnoff. He's also Director of Regional Studies. He has a PhD from King's College London, and he is the moderator for today. Please join me in welcoming our expert panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us for part 2 of this symposium. My name is Michael Sharnoff, Director of Regional Studies at Daniel Morgan Graduate School. As we continue the conversation, I will introduce each panelist, and after everyone has spoken, I will ask questions to the panelists, and then we will open it up to Q&A. So our first panelist is Tom Cosento, Brigadier General, U.S. Army retired, and former Commandant of the National War College, Chief Operating Officer, Business Executives for National Security. And Mr. Cosentino will be speaking today about Middle East energy and security.
Well, thank you. So a lot of my thunder stolen by Dr. Wihbey very effectively, but I would like to, congratulate you. I think that was an excellent presentation, and Colonel Maclachlan. And it really set the conditions for what I wanted to talk about, which is the U.S. is, in fact, right now, the critical actor related to energy and security in the Middle East. And that dynamic, as Dr. Wihbey pointed out, has changed dramatically in a relatively short period of time. For the last 16 years, really, since 9/11, there's been 3 pillars to U.S. Middle East policy. And off of those 3 pillars, or 3 legs of a stool for a strategic approach, the Middle East has reacted. And those, frankly, are oil, Israel, and terrorism. Those are the 3 driving factors of U.S. strategy in the Middle East. As Dr. Wihbey pointed out, going back to the Carter Doctrine, the U.S. was committed to the uninterrupted free market flow of energy from the Middle East to market. And the U.S. has been committed since 1948, but really fundamentally since the 73 war, to guaranteeing underwriting the security of the State of Israel through aid, training, money, and the best high-tech equipment that money can buy. And since 9/11, the U.S. has looked at the Middle East as both a target for terrorism and a platform for terrorism that it had to deal with on a consistent basis. So those 3 pillars then were the U.S.'s approach to the Middle East, and everybody in the region reacted to that in one way or another, and reacted to U.S. initiatives, strategy, whether it was preemptive doctrine of President Bush or leading from behind of the Obama administration. It caused a reaction. What we did relative to our approach to those 3 pillars drove the situation in the Middle East. That's, as Dr. Wihbey pointed out, to a large degree, those pillars have been undercut by not only the geopolitical events in the region, but by the changing nature of the energy market and energy supply. And I'd like to just point out a few things and emphasize, re-emphasize comments that were already made, but talk about why that's important. So the first one in the area of technology is fracking efficiency. We're at a point today which is fundamentally different from where we were in 2009, where the break-even point has moved from the high 70s per barrel down to $48 per barrel. This morning I took a look, it was $51 per barrel. As long as oil is running between $50 and $60, people are making money. We're going to keep fracking, we're going to keep drilling. That has provided a steady and reliable market for American oil. The second is what's happening to a large degree below the radar of the American people, and that is a revolution in battery power storage. Believe it or not, even though billions of dollars may be perceived have been wasted during the investment of money in 2009, a lot of that money, when you throw it out there, eventually it causes something to grow out of it. And one of the big areas that's grown out of money into alternative energy is the ability to store energy. Today, I don't know if many of you follow what Tesla does, but Tesla has refined the technology to the point where through software upgrades and they can actually sell your ability to store power. So during the hurricane, a lot of the people who had bought the cheaper version of Tesla and were trying to get out of Florida, Tesla was able to send a software upgrade that was time limited that allowed them to access more power that already existed in their battery to get out of Florida. And then they were able to turn it off and said, if you want that permanently, you got to pay for it. So this is a revolution that's happening below the noise level. What does that mean? Well, in practical purposes, for $15,000, a combination of solar and storage capability would allow you to, if you had 250 days of sun a year, to be fully independent and pretty much off the grid for the American consumer in a average 3 to 4 bedroom, 2,500 square foot home. That's revolutionary. That's going to change the demand signal. It's hugely, it's going to change it hugely. The third piece under this is the extraction capability of the Chinese government of rare earths. China sits on about 80% of the rare earths in the world, and their ability to get them out of the ground and refine them for commercial use has exploded in the last few years. That also is going to change economic relationships. I'll come back to that in a second. Reference Israel. We've since 9/11 alone, we've given Israel close to $100 billion in direct aid through both the agreements after Camp David, but also in supplemental agreements. What does that mean? Well, the Israelis have been, that has largely funded the technological revolution in the Israeli Defense Force, so that right now they are by far and away, outside of the United States, the most capable military force and high-tech force in the region. The innovations like Iron Dome, which we helped fund the Israelis, which is a missile defense shield, which they in turn now are selling back to us. And we're going to buy Iron Dome for our own uses. it's a brilliant strategy on the part of the Israelis. Drone technology, high-tech targeting, long-range missiles. The Israelis are a military powerhouse, but they've also taken these technological advances and turned themselves into an economic powerhouse. They are driving a good part of economic development in the Levant region right now, especially inside of the Palestinian territories, which is their untapped labor pool in Jordan, and very, very quietly in Egypt. Along with this is the emergence of the Levant gas fields, which gives Israel the potential, along if they reach agreement with Lebanon, Cyprus, and Egypt, to satisfy a good portion of the energy requirements of Europe, fundamentally changing the field of things. And then I would say the third piece from a U.S. standpoint is our own military technological advancements in drone technology, reconnaissance, ability to operate offshore. All of that reduces our requirement to be onshore in the Middle East. So what's happening because of this? Well, you can't, in the Middle East, you can't separate people, leaders from politics. It's very much of a personality-driven political environment. And as a result of that, and we don't have the time to go through all of the frictions, President Sisi and the Emir in Qatar, the king and the Emir, king of Saudi Arabia and the Emir in Qatar, the role of King Abdullah as both an Israeli client and a Saudi client, and the home of the biggest refugee population in the region. All of these things have shifted alliances in the region. So what's emerging is what you might call the moderate slash monarchy states: Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Kuwait is always kind of trying to hide in the dust. And the religious states: Qatar, Iran, Turkey, Hezbollah, and to a lesser degree, Hamas. That's a friction point that's happening without us in the middle. And why is that happening? Because we go back to our fundamental interests, which were oil, Israel, and terrorism. We don't need the oil as much as we did before. Matter of fact, if oil gets disrupted anywhere in that region, we just frack more and pump more oil here. It's all fungible, and in Canada, for that matter. We have fully invested in the Israelis, and the Israelis, in turn, have invested their political capital in building an alliance with these quote-unquote moderate Arab states. And so the existential threats to Israel are greatly reduced and focused around that religious alliance of Iran, Turkey, Hezbollah, Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas. That's the lineup right now, and we're not in either one of those lineups. We are watching this from somewhat of a distance. The last thing I wanted to say is as conflict happens there, and we try to manage this from a distance, other outside actors have an interest in the region: China, India. But you have to know the history of both Chinese global intervention or activities and Indian. Neither one of them want to get in the middle of problems on the ground. So what's driving those two states? And General Gregson can talk to that more. But it's the demand for energy. That's really all they want. If they can get it from somewhere else, they'll buy it. And they have no vested interest in getting in the middle of this conflict between these two alliances. So what does that shape up to? There are a lot of reasons why there could be conflict between the U.S. and China, but I don't believe energy is one of them. My personal belief is there's many more synergies between a country that currently holds cheap and plentiful and abundant petroleum products, especially natural gas, and a country that sits on 80% of the world's rare earths, both of which have different reasons, domestic political reasons, whether it's pollution in China and national sovereignty, or whether it's a changing demographic balance that's more interested in global warming and the environment in the U.S., to find an accommodation around those two areas. That leaves the Middle East out of luck, in my view. What would pull us back in? Well, the thing that my view 3 years ago would have been nothing. Nothing will pull us back in until we had the Syrian diaspora into Europe. I would not count, if I was from the Middle East, in that pulling the United States back in. The election yesterday in Germany, which ended up with the alternative for Germany, for Deutschland, winning 13% of the vote, there's an undercurrent concerned about closing borders in Europe. And at this point, they've been able to manage it. But if there is a general war in the Middle East and we talk about 20 or 30 million people on the move, I think those borders get closed down pretty darn fast. And at that point, the imperative for U.S. involvement in the Middle East goes even further down. So I would just leave you with that. That's probably a non-traditional view of where things are going. But I think the failure of both the Saudis and the Iranians especially, because they're the ones who have the money currently to invest in good governance, in putting their people to work, in building downstream industry, their clock has pretty much run out. So what they're left with now is this artificial rivalry between Sunni and Shia that is really geopolitical in nature and is dependent on the U.S. being sucked into their fight, which I don't believe in the future that we necessarily will be. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Cosentino, for those excellent remarks. Our next speaker is retired Marine Lieutenant General Wallace Gregson, Senior Director for China and the Pacific at the Center for the National Interest, and today he will speak about Asian energy issues, the South China Sea, and One Belt, One Road.
Thank you, Dr. Sarnoff, and thank you, Tom. I'll try to be equally succinct, if not equally eloquent. Maya Angelou once said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And China has been telling us who they are for quite some time. China's whole-of-government efforts to expand influence in East Asia and across Eurasia threatens to Finlandize our allies and friends and limit our access to Indo-Asian markets, including energy, by changing the post-war system that did so much to enable China's rise. Our application of our national power must be greatly improved. We need an Indo-Asian grand strategy to address all the problems as a group. South China Sea today is where U.S. and Chinese vital interests compete. At issue are access to hydrocarbons, trade routes, sovereign sea and airspace, and free and secure access to the global commons. The Energy Information Administration predicts 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas are under this sea, but that's not yet proven. 32% of aggregate world trade, 5.3 trillion U.S. dollars, transit the South China Sea yearly, including 80% of Japan's energy imports. The rights of Philippines, Vietnam, and other nations to access their exclusive economic zones are challenged. China's wealth and population are concentrated near the east and the South China Sea coastline. Our 5 treaty allies in Japan and Taiwan depend on free and secure commercial and military access to the South China Sea, and our allies are hedging, particularly the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. 10 ASEAN nations are in that region, and 8 of their members are on the South China Sea littoral. ASEAN's population is the 3rd largest in the world, and the U.S. exports over $100 billion in goods and services to ASEAN yearly, supporting over 500,000 U.S. jobs. Access to ASEAN is important to us. The region includes territorial disputes, existing and emerging nuclear threats, transnational terrorism, and the world's most recent use of weapons of mass destruction, the VX attack in Malaysia, demonstrating North Korea's sophisticated capabilities and dangerous will. That attack sent a message to every country in the region hosting North Korean laborers. Today's challenges lie both at the high end of conflict and in a gray zone of political, military, and economic competition between peace and war, with escalation a real possibility. The PRC Path to Rejuvenation was announced by Xi Jinping in November 2012. China's nationalist ambitions mandate the recovery of lost territory, specifically including islands, rocks, and low tide elevations deemed by China to be Chinese from ancient times. China successfully defied the ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague on the illegality of its 9-line claim around the South China Sea. All nations on the East and South China Sea littoral and the United States are directly affected. The United States declares it will fly, sail, and operate forces wherever international law allows. Directly opposed to this is China's often stated, quote, indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters, as well as the seabed and subsoil thereof. This is now part of their nationalist narrative demanding reversal of past violations of Chinese sovereignty. China already has de facto control over the South China Sea. Their land creation efforts demonstrate China's ability and will to act as they wish in the South China Sea. Their new port and airfield outposts come at the cost of the destruction of vast coral reefs, the essential nursery of marine life, with as yet uncalculated costs to sustainability of South China Sea and Pacific marine life. And these are not small outposts that they built. Mischief Reef is as large as metropolitan Washington, D.C. Subi Reef is as large as Pearl Harbor. These same garrison complexes are well-suited and very capable of supporting energy extraction operations throughout the South China Sea. China's extensive coastline offers numerous ports and airfields supporting direct and immediate access of Chinese military, maritime auxiliary forces, drillers, dredges, and fishing vessels to the seas. Her continuing investment in rockets and missiles distributed throughout their massive geographic sanctuary signals an intent to effect sea control and impose area denial from the land. Their pursuit of maneuvering ballistic missile warheads to attack large moving targets is another indicator of their intentions. China's vast fishing fleets, increasingly under state sponsorship and control, are always close to their support structure. These vast fishing fleets, in cooperation with the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime auxiliary resources, shoulder Vietnamese, Philippine, and other nations' fishermen out of their fishing areas within their EEZs and even their territorial waters. Support for military sea and air forces, maritime auxiliary, and fishing fleets has now been extended well into the South China Sea and into the territorial seas of other littoral states. China's maritime militia, managed by PLA military commands and funded by local and provincial governments, is successful and growing, as are armed Chinese fishermen. It's the world's largest such organization. It was employed in 2009, impeccable incident at Scarborough Shoal in 2012, and in support of exploration during drilling in Vietnamese waters in 2014. It has a publicly declared presence on the new artificial features in the South China Sea. Looking at the other direction, China's One Belt, One Road is the western complement to their eastward, south, and East China Sea expansion. It's Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy effort announced in 2013. It spans 65 countries. The 21st century maritime Silk Road echoes Admiral Zheng He's 14th century voyages. The Silk Road economic belt traverses the continent with two main and many subsidiary routes. The goal is annual trade worth $2.25 trillion between China and these countries in 10 years. Building up oil, gas, coal, and electricity infrastructure is a major component. The framework is open-ended, and it combines new and old projects. Russia, Iran, India, South Korea, Turkey, and even Japan have similar visions and plans across the Eurasian continent. Western multinationals are selling billions of dollars of equipment, technology, and services to Chinese firms doing the building. These include GE, Caterpillar, Honeywell, ABB, DHL, Lind, BASF, Maersk, and Deutsche Bank, among others. A bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, was established to help fund the One Belt, One Road initiative. 57 countries participate. China is the main shareholder. China may be exporting its excess production capability with the intent to create a colonial empire. 86% of OBOR projects have Chinese contractors, 27% have local ones, and 18% have foreign contractors. To save you doing the math, yes, they add to more than 100%, but it's because different projects have multiple contractors. Past practice in other places indicates preference for Chinese labor over local labor, fostering resentment. Foreign contractors are likely to have contracts only while their technological advantage lasts. China's past practices cause adverse reaction. The U.S. Trade Representative calls China a, quote, unprecedented threat not governed by existing rules. The EU is drafting stricter rules on Chinese investment. Illegal practices like hacking and outright technology theft cause anger. Narrative control through Confucius Institutes and other organs of information are resented. Intense competition in all sectors raises fears of employment loss. Unfair, ungoverned, i.e. no regulation, practices raise issues such as demands that foreign companies hand over technology as the price of doing business in China, and restrictions that bar entering Chinese business sectors and selective targeting in monopoly cases also exist. Chinese punishment over Korean firms over Korea's missile defense decisions are a recent example. Sometime earlier, the Chinese punished Japanese firms operating in China over political issues. China still faces obstacles. The Chinese economy is slowing down and running up debts to prop the renminbi and employment. More and more investment will be needed to keep the economy growing, and many states borrowing from China will be unable to repay the loans, adding to the debt burden. Xi Jinping reportedly has a growing list of enemies as he reverses an evolution toward more collective decision-making. Capital flight from China as those able to move currency and family members to safe havens is another phenomenon that China is trying to arrest. Making all this come out peacefully will require more skill and subtlety than the U.S. government is usually known for. But this is a time when we need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gregson, for those excellent remarks. Our third speaker is the Honorable David Hancock, the former Prime Minister of Alberta Province in Canada. And today, Mr. Hancock will be speaking about Canadian and American energy issues.
Well, thank you, and it's interesting to fit into the context between the Middle East and the Asia Pacific in terms of what's happening on the world energy market. But I think it's really an important time for us to look at what Secretary Perry has talked about in terms of continental energy strategies, something that a concept that's been coming out of Canada for a number of years, of course, in our self-interest at the time, but something that's really now, I think, more in the American interest as well. The global market supply is the first area. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact of technology. It was touched on earlier, but technology, in my view, I would assert, is going to play a much larger role than geopolitics in the question of carbon energy over the next number of years. Of course, there's the impact of the environmental issues around the utilization of carbon energy, and that's maybe gaining some steam in the wake of people linking recent climate events like hurricanes, et cetera, and the increase in that to carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, et cetera. So that's going to have an impact on our thinking and a process going forward. Alternative energy was mentioned about how we can be off the grid, utilizing alternative energies, and the way in which price has come down on solar and to a certain extent on wind, but the impact of alternative energies on the market as well. And that leads right into the whole America First policy that President Trump has been talking about. And again, comes back then to the concept of a continental energy and policy and what that means for us. And then I think the context of how you fit all of that into, when you're talking about national security cannot be parochial. Obviously, when we're talking about the Middle East and the impact of refugees on other world states, how that discombobulates the status quo in other states will impact on us as a continent, whether we're engaged in that process or not. But there's also food security and water security issues that need to be brought into that context. So, global market supply. One of the emerging pieces, obviously, is that OPEC's no longer in control. OPEC is no longer going to be the engine that sets the price. They can't control their state productions. They don't have all the states that have productions, and with the technology that's moved fracking forward and released tight oil and gas and shale oil and gas in the United States and brought United States production into a major player, OPEC is increasingly irrelevant in the whole global price setting piece. That matters. That matters from a lot of perspectives. Not good news necessarily for Canada, because high prices, when you have a carbon energy economy, which we basically do, high prices are not a bad thing. But the reality is that as the prices go down, you can continue to play. As was mentioned, was it $22 a barrel you mentioned for? No, $50 a barrel for
48,
48,
break
yeah,
even,
yeah.
as of today.
Yeah. But some are talking about some plays that can produce at $22 a barrel. Suncor president just the other day said that Suncor has a major stake in the Alberta oil sands, and they can produce and pay a dividend to their shareholders at $37 a barrel. So, $50 a barrel is not a killer. It was a shock. It was a reset, but it's not a killer to the energy industry. So, one of the things that's really bringing that price down and setting, and I say OPEC's no longer the price setter, is technology. And I would argue that technology is going to play a much larger role than geopolitics in the question of carbon energy and carbon supply. Fracking's not a new technology. Fracking has been used for years in our oil fields and gas fields, but the improvement of the technology to use it to free up tight gas and shale gas hit us in about the year 2000, and the price immediately dropped from about $11 a gigajoule to about $3 a gigajoule almost overnight, and has maintained at that level. And that's using technology that, again, that's been around forever but has been improved and utilized now on our shale and tight gas formations. Well, it was inevitable that was going to move into the oil area. I mean, if anybody didn't see that, they weren't looking. We were surprisingly unprepared for it from an industry perspective, because we were, busily enjoying $100 to $120 a barrel oil, and who wouldn't just continue pumping at that rate and selling? But the technology was coming. You could see it coming, and we had a 10-year window from when it hit in gas. And now, of course, it's utilized well across the U.S., increasing U.S. oil production substantially, and bringing the price down. But the other side of that is it helps us on the question of being less dependent on the rest of the world for all of our manufacturing and other things. In other words, the overall security level is enhanced, in my view, with a lower energy price, even if I'm speaking against my country's interest in terms of our energy economy. Just to put it in perspective in terms of supply, Alberta alone, and Alberta is one province in the country, albeit we have the major energy resources, but not the only energy resources. 31 trillion cubic feet of conventional natural gas reserves, 3,424 trillion cubic feet of shale and siltstone-hosted hydrocarbon resource in place. Now, that's not producible. You don't know if it's producible until you actually drill it. But that's a lot of gas. I've been in politics for the last 18 years. Some would say it's a lot of hot air. But on the oil side, 1 billion barrels of conventional crude reserves. That used to be our sustenance, the conventional oil fields. But there's 166 billion barrels in the bitumen reserves in the oil sands. 166 billion barrels. 423 billion barrels of shale oil in place. That's just Alberta. The fields go into northeastern BC, they go into the Northwest Territories, and then there's offshore oil and gas plays available in the Mackenzie Basin and off the Northwest Territories. So there is no shortage of carbon energy. The issue is at what price can you produce it, and can it be competitive? But the reality is the energy is there. So, and the price is now down at a much lower level because of the abundance, particularly in the United States. But we're still selling, and the graph I think that Paul Michael put up shows the continuing increase of supply from Canada into the United States market of energy. What wasn't shown on the graph, I don't think you put that graph up, was the increasing supply of energy from the United States into Canada. The export ban was removed in November of 2015, or early December 2015. Almost an immediate supply of about 500,000 barrels per day from the Bakken fields into eastern Canada. Ironic, actually, because we spent about 8 years trying to get the Keystone Pipeline approved to move some oil south. It took about 3 days to move 500,000 barrels across the border going north. But it speaks to the whole issue of continental energy, and I'll come back to that. But one of the intervening pieces is this whole question of greenhouse gas, climate change, and environmental concerns, and the movement towards alternative energy sources. Certainly picking up steam in other parts of the world. Certainly Canada has played very heavily into that, as sort of trying to make sure we sustain our markets by meeting their requirements. And so one of the issues facing the development of Canadian energy resources is the price points, the cost of production. Arguably, one of the reasons we don't do as much upgrading and refining as we ought to is the cost of building a plant in the $10 to $15 billion range, because we have to build for our environment. Well, everyone else does as well. I mean, people face hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, but we have to build for a harsh environment. We have to we use arguably much more expensive labor and human resources, and ironically, we build we have a cost of environmental regulation that is significantly higher than most places in the world. We get a black eye for the dirty oil coming out of the oil sands, but the reality is we've got tougher environmental regulations than virtually any other supplier in the world, including California. The heavy oil coming out of Bakersfield is not subjected to the same environmental regulations as the heavy oil coming out of Alberta. So these are our cost factors, and that's not going to go away. I mean, every time we have a hurricane now or a weather event, somebody's talking about it being connected to climate change, and that's connected to carbon energy, and that's connected to oil production. So those pieces are going to continue. It used to be my thesis that that the price point at about $120 a barrel was where you started to see competition in energy, because solar energy, even wind energy, other forms of energy were very expensive. They hadn't got the technologies down, and they really didn't start to compete with carbon energy until you hit over the $120 a barrel price point. With the change in the environmental discussion, of course, governments are more prone to subsidize, to bring the prices down. And of course, technological improvement has happened in that side as well, so the overall solar energy price point has come down significantly. More people are producing. So that's a risk factor. But it doesn't take away from the fact that that we have carbon energy, we have an abundant supply of carbon energy, and in my view, notwithstanding various nations and states talking about only allowing the sale of electric cars after 2030 or 2040 or 2025, we're still going to be using carbon energy for some considerable period of time. And therefore, it makes sense for us to be assured of our supply and to have that supply in an increasingly difficult world, as we were talking about with the Middle East and the potential for significant refugee populations, et cetera. Real discombobulation on that side. The emergence of China in the global economy as a leader and a needer of energy, and beginning to worry about what the world thinks, and so looking at how they can move perhaps off coal onto something better, which might be gas or even oil. So those are interesting dynamics that help us. And the other piece then would be President Trump's focus on America first. You're not going to repatriate jobs to the Rust Belt or to the United States without low energy costs. That would be my thesis. Low energy costs are absolutely critical to that particular economic policy and drive. Why? Well, because you're not going to be cutting the cost of human resources much. That's an area where the other parts of the world will always be able to outcompete us on the price of human resources, particularly because they, again, do not impose necessarily the same safety standards or regulatory burdens that we put on ourselves, whether you're in Canada or the United States. And so how are you going to actually repatriate the manufacturing sector and other sectors? Well, it's got to be lower input costs. It's got to be, particularly, it's got to be low energy costs. So there's a driving factor there, in my belief, to keep that energy cost in the $50 to $60 a barrel range, a range which will allow production with profit, but which will also keep energy competitive in the U.S. market and the continental market. Which leads us to the question of the continental energy policy. There's no question that the United States is no longer as dependent on external supply and has removed the barrier to export, so it's now playing also into the global market. I think we'll hear that a little bit on the LNG side when we talk about Chenier and liquid natural gas. But if you look at the geopolitical impact of that, if you start shipping LNG, and I don't want to steal any of your thunder, but if you start shipping LNG into the European market and start weeding them off the Russia pipelines, that can have a significant difference in the world market. And obviously the same in terms of supplying China and India, for that matter. So continental energy policy, in my view, we should be moving forward with it. We're looking at issues like the Keystone Pipeline, which at one point was a key tool for particularly the Alberta economy, getting our crude to the Gulf Coast where the refineries were equipped to handle the heavy oil. And some would argue on the Canadian political scene why we cared about that. We should be going east or west with pipelines, and absolutely we should, because we need to have an alternative market to the U.S. But we're having trouble with that because of our environmental regulations and consultation policies and a number of other issues. But the reality is, until the refineries on the Gulf Coast are filled up, we're not going to be actually getting any investment into refineries in our area of the world. And if we start to flatten the curve on carbon energy consumption for fuel, what are we going to do with our carbon? We need to have refineries because we need the upstream products as part of our market. We need to diversify from just burning the fuel to creating other things with it. And we're not going to get there with our cost structures unless we can get the competition out of the way. And the competition, quite frankly, are the Gulf Coast refineries right now. They need to be filled up before anybody's going to think about putting $10 billion from the market into Alberta. We have right now the Northwest Upgrader, which will be opening in, I think, early next year, But that's only happened because the government has taken its royalty as bitumen royalty in kind and has used that as a feedstock to the local refinery. In other words, government intervention, albeit of a modest nature perhaps, has made that happen. And that's the only way we get it, is if we create the tax structures and incentivize it in some way. So the Keystone actually has a bigger role to play, in my view, and that's in north-south energy infrastructure, which ties us together even more broadly in the ability to keep energy within the continent and average out the prices on the continent. Leads to the question of what's happening with Mexico. There's no shortage of supply in Canada. The U.S. has certainly developed a significant supply. Mexico production has been going down, and there's a lower amount of the U.S. supply. And in fact, it's become a customer of U.S. gas, particularly. Some would argue that that now that the government has backed out a little bit and taken away the monopoly that Pemex had, that private companies' exploration and production will increase the role of Mexico. Others would argue that Mexico has such an emerging population that they're going to need to eat their own supply for their own economic development. But nonetheless, they will be part of that continental energy policy process. They need to be part of that. Venezuela has been touched on, and I'm not going to pursue that any further. I think that was discussed very well. The long and short of it is they have a huge supply. I think they're in the top in the world, 1, 2, or 3 in the world in terms of their known reserves. But the stability of production and the whole question of where they're going to play has really taken them out of the mix so far in terms of the filling those refineries in the Gulf Coast, which were probably built to take their supply as opposed to taking Alberta bitumen. So my thesis is that we need a continental energy policy, that a low energy cost of around the $50 mark is, we're going to have to get over the price shock, but in the long run it'll be better for your economy and for ours, or for the continental economy for that matter. That supply is not going to be an issue, so we're not going to be beholden to OPEC or anyone else setting the supply or setting the price. And in fact, we're going to be able to play a larger role in the world dynamic. I mentioned shipping gas perhaps to Europe, supplying the Asia-Pacific market, and whether we do that through the U.S. or from a Canadian perspective, get a pipeline to the coast, we'll be able to actually not only achieve some repatriation of the economic model back to our shores, but also play more heavily in the world supply of energy. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hancock, for sharing your unique insights. As a reminder, if you have questions, which are welcome, please write them down on those index cards and pass them back to the back so they can be to the ends of the aisle so they can be taken for the Q&A.
Check my notes.
Thank you.
Anything.
Really interested in what you said.
As you're doing that, I'll introduce our last but certainly not least panelist. We have Robert Fee, the Chief of Staff and Acting Senior Vice President of External Affairs at Cheniere Energy, and he will be speaking about Cheniere Energy and the global LNG market.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Daniel Morgan Graduate School for having me here. Talking about the changing energy market is an important topic, and kind of robust conversation on these issues is important. I'm happy to be here to talk about kind of our small part in that, and Cheniere is a good example of the changing global and the changing energy situation in the U.S. So Cheniere was originally founded as an E&P company, but Cheniere kind of really was a regasification company. So we built a terminal in Louisiana to import LNG. And this was in the early 2000s, before the shale gas revolution. And there were over a dozen import facilities that were built in the U.S. with the expectation that the U.S. was going to become a significant importer of LNG. Shale gas revolution changed all of that. As my colleague mentioned earlier, fracking technology, or I guess the technology that enabled both hydraulic fracturing and horizontal laterals, has existed for a long time. It actually started in the 1970s and was actually funded by the predecessor for the Department of Energy. So it was a combination of federal R&D and then taken up by pioneers such as George Marshall in the private sector that led to this revolution. But it took 30 years of technological improvements and then also the United States' unique regulatory mix and kind of infrastructure that enabled the shale gas revolution. But Cheniere had begun our history as a regas company. When the terminal was actually opened in Louisiana, it was in 2008, and that was when shale gas prices or natural gas prices in the U.S. went from double digits down to $3. So Cheniere's stock fell with it. Cheniere made the decision to switch to export, and we were the first company to do so. We were the first company to receive the license from the Department of Energy to export, and we're now the first U.S. company to export starting in February of 2016. And so you actually had the combination of the kind of oil export ban being lifted in December of 2015, and then the first U.S. LNG exports in February 2016 that have really changed the global energy situation. And are leading to a more transparent and open and free global energy market. I believe that these are good things. So initially, when kind of the U.S. shifted from a country that was going to import LNG to exporting LNG, that immediately changed the global market. U.S. companies had signed significant deals for volumes, and so countries like Qatar had built new liquefaction facility to service the U.S. When Cheniere flipped our terminal around, that gas was freed up to go anywhere else. And so that has helped lead to kind of this increased global LNG trade and more significant demand for LNG. Right now, in the global LNG market, you have a lot of people are talking about a quote-unquote glut, and it's combined with kind of the quote-unquote lower for longer oil price situation. So the glut is that there's a lot of U.S. LNG supply coming online. So Cheniere has two facilities, one in Louisiana and one in Texas. And then there are three other facilities that are being built in the U.S. But then there's a lot of supply in Australia that is coming online right now. And so that future LNG supply over the next couple of years has helped push prices down, combined with the low oil price due to a combination of factors, most certainly U.S. shale, but also kind of increased production from, or the lack of the ability for OPEC and non-OPEC countries to limit their production, although there have been multiple attempts on that. This lower oil price environment is leading towards kind of these increased supplies and then also these low prices. It's changing a lot of the market. The U.S. will be in a competition with the rest of the world for market share for LNG growth. There's something along the lines of 30 BCF per day of projects in the U.S., LNG export projects in the U.S., and the majority of these will not get built. U.S. companies we're competing against each other, but we're also competing against the international oil companies that still have a major role in this, like Shell, Total, Exxon, but then also countries like Qatar, the largest LNG exporter, increasingly Russia, as well as Australia. But U.S. LNG is fundamentally changing the market. And I wanted to bring this map because, to me, this is just the best example of it. U.S. LNG traditionally has been a business that's been point to point. You need LNG, I have stranded gas, we'll sign a contract together. With that, I'm able to go to a bank, get financing for these incredibly expensive facilities, and build our facility, and then I'll start sending you the gas. And those contracts traditionally have been linked to oil, and they've had destination clauses in them. So if you're a buyer and I was buying from you, and you sell the gas to me, I have to take it and I have to use it in country. If I didn't want it, if I didn't need it, let's say I have a mild winter, then I would still have to pay for it, but I just wouldn't pick it up. US LNG does not have destination clauses. So that means our LNG can go anywhere. So we have about 14 foundation customers, but we've exported to 25 countries. It's 25, that's over half of the countries that import LNG. And the reason that is because whether we sell to our customers who then resell elsewhere around the world, or we sell directly, LNG, or US LNG, is going where the market dictates. And again, this is, in our mind, a beneficial thing. LNG is becoming more similar to oil in terms of a global commodity. So oil, we talked about the oil price right now. Everyone knows what the oil price is. If I ask this crowd what the LNG price was, depends where you're from. There isn't an LNG price. A lot of LNG is linked to oil. There are, some index prices in different parts of the world, but it's not a global commodity, and that is really because, it's expensive to transport. But it is increasingly moving towards becoming a more global commodity. I think somewhere along the lines of 15 to 20% of global LNG trade is now on the spot market. That's up significantly from just 10 or 15 years ago when it was around 5%. And you'll see that continue to go forward. And I think it'll be interesting to watch where US LNG goes going forward. So right now, you'll see that the majority of our LNG is going to Latin America, which makes sense. I mean, certainly just because of transportation costs, US LNG has a natural benefit. But after that, it's going to Asia. So Asian demand remains strong. Japan and Korea are traditionally the biggest importers of LNG. But you're also seeing a significant increase in LNG consumption in countries like China. And there's a mix of market factors and policy factors that are causing that. So in China, generally LNG growth is linked to economic growth. But in China, for example, their quote-unquote war on pollution and their policy that is dictating coal to gas switching is what's really leading this increase in natural gas consumption. Now, they source natural gas from Central Asia, in the future from a pipeline, the Power of Siberia in Russia, as well as have their own indigenous production. But they are increasingly buying more and more amounts of LNG. Europe, which has gotten a lot of press, has been kind of has not to date received a lot of LNG. For Cheniere Energy, we want to send our LNG to premium markets where we can get the best price. A lot of people, a lot of market watchers think that if LNG prices continue to go down, that's when you'll see a lot of LNG to Europe, as it acts as a sink for LNG. So right now we have sent cargoes to Poland and Lithuania in Northwest Europe and other countries. I think we expect to see more of that. Do we expect Poland and Lithuania to sign long-term contracts with us? We hope. If they do, it'll be destination-free LNG, so they'll bring some to Poland, or they can bring somewhere elsewhere. But really, I think that these are going to be determined by market forces. More than, market forces and policy. Again, it's a global commodity, so price is going to be, and always will be, I think, one of the most important factors. I want to kind of speak quickly so we can leave room for Q&A, but I think thinking about U.S. policy and LNG exports, I do think that there's three things that are really important to keep in mind. One is supply. In the U.S., we have, this robust and incredible kind of oil and gas industry that has, that is resilient, that is driving down the costs and really able to compete in the global marketplace because of their ability to again, manage costs, but also, it's because of our free market. There have been a lot of U.S. companies that have gone bankrupt because of the low prices. And some companies in some areas can make money at $50 a barrel, but not the majority of them. So it'll be interesting to watch, but U.S. companies are continuing to drive down the costs. Policies that support the industry, that support infrastructure are helpful. But we also believe that policies that are focused on the climate benefits of gas are important. So the Paris Agreement for us is something that's beneficial to natural gas. You're seeing, like China as an earlier example, significant coal to gas switching. That's something that helps our business, but we also think that that's beneficial for the globe. I mean, not only does natural gas have 50% less carbon emissions than coal, but more importantly, it has near zero traditional pollutants such as NOx, SOx, and particulate matters. So, China is primarily making these decisions because they need to clean up their air quality for their citizens. Certainly there are climate aspects to it, but these are, environmental air quality is an issue not just in China, but in much of the world, including in the Asian region and Middle East and North Africa. So, displacing coal with LNG, and preferably U.S. LNG from Cheniere, has economic benefits, but it also has social and environmental benefits. So, we believe that addressing issues like methane upstream are important, as well as supporting international and multilateral agreements such as the Paris Agreement. And then finally, just to kind of talk about, the continent, you saw with the oil export ban, Canadian oil come to the U.S., but then also U.S. oil go to Canada. We're seeing incredible flows of gas from Canada to the U.S. We have exported gas that we have purchased in Canada. We're able to transport down to the Gulf Coast and then export that. The U.S. is also exporting a lot of gas to Mexico, and with the denationalization of Pemex, you also hope that eventually Mexican production will be able to increase, and they have shale gas reserves. So I think we all benefit from more global integrated gas markets, and that's nowhere is that more true than in North America, because you're going to see flows on the East Coast. There's been gas, LNG imported in Canada that's gone down to the U.S., but you'll also see gas from the U.S. go up to Canada. So having this ability to have an integrated market that's transparent is beneficial. North America is a great example of that. If you look at it globally, I think that's even more so. And that's what's really interesting about U.S. LNG, because we have this slide, but you can track this on real time. There are apps on your phone that have shipping trackers that show kind of where U.S. LNG is going. So having that transparent market is a good thing. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fee, for that terrific presentation. I have one question that I'll throw out to the panelists, and then we'll move to the audience questions. When we talk about natural energy imports and exports, obviously there's a science and technology component. You have to get it out of the ground with fracking. You have to transport it. Obviously, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, so economics, clearly, this is for-profit, plays a role. But could you all speak to the importance of understanding the politics and the state and non-state actors and the regions in which you're operating? Because it's more than just business, right? It's also politics.
Well, in the case of the Middle East, it's all politics in these two emerging sides, and then the fact that it's personality-based. The problem for them is, has been pointed out really across the board, is they don't dominate the market anymore. There's a supplier, but there's elasticity in supply. So whatever comes offline there gets replaced by Canadian or U.S. energy. And I believe with Mr. Free that there's going to be an increasing. I think the environmental piece of this can't be minimized. It won't be through government policy, it'll be through choice of people. I think the millennial generation will want to have a balance of reasonably priced energy and a healthier environment. So we're going to move to more LNG. We're going to move to, we'll still use cheap extractable oil, but with cleaner technologies around it, and we're going to have alternative energy. That leaves the Middle East up a creek, frankly, because they have not thought through this. They haven't invested in their people. They don't, outside of maybe both Israel and the UAE, who are on the fringes, and so the politics of this is going to come almost in around blackmail related to refugees, and I don't think it's going to work, to be honest with you. I think it works when it's 1 million refugees and you can reasonably say you can relocate them. When it's 20, 30 million, general war and terrorism across the region, I think containment is going to be the policy of not only the U.S. and Europe, but of Asia too. And we'll work around that solution. It's a very grim view of what's coming for the Middle East, but that's, I think, the truth of it.
If I may press you, do the Saudis have a plan? How are they diversifying their economy in reaction to these new geopolitical changes?
Yeah, I think all of them have quote-unquote diversification plans. The challenge is they have not yet, I believe, and this could change, I mean, with forward-looking leadership, they have not yet really accepted the hard decisions that come with diversification, which means lessening control, freeing up when you keep half your population out of productive capability. You know, women are not producing in Saudi Arabia. That's a political decision of the government of Saudi Arabia. And to a large degree, that's reflected in other places in the region. So when you send your kids away for education and social sciences and come back and give them fake jobs, when you buy off large chunks of your population, which all the states do, and when you keep half the population out of being productive members of society, it's not a pleasant outcome. That's got to change. It will change one way or the other. It'll either change through implosion or it'll change through a last gasp effort of reform.
Thank you.
Well, just to segue off that, if you take a look at the Alberta and Canadian economy that's been fairly dependent on carbon energy, and we haven't diversified the way we would have liked to, particularly in Alberta, not because we have the challenges that he was talking about, I assure you, but because when you're fully deployed in your human financial resources and extracting carbon energy and selling it, and you're making good money at it, it's very difficult to get people to focus on other aspects of the economy and to invest in other aspects of the economy. And so every time we've had a downturn, and carbon energy has always operated in cycles, every time we've had a downturn, that's when you make gains on the diversification side. You learn how to do new and better things in agriculture and forestry, which are other two elements, or you move into health and biosciences and life sciences, and we have good backgrounds in those. But making great leaps forward only happens when oil prices go down and people start looking for other places to invest. And they don't do that when the prices are $100 a barrel or higher. So the diversification piece has been a real challenge. I was in government for 18 years, and people always say, well, why aren't you doing more to diversify the economy? And the first answer, of course, is that's the private sector's job. But the second answer is you really cannot move people away from what they know well and what they're doing well at when you're fully deployed financially and with human resources over $100 a barrel in oil. I mean, it's just not doable. So these changes are going to make significant aspects. But you asked about the political pieces, and here's the challenge we have, and I think you have here in the U.S. as well, maybe not to the same extent. And let me start by saying I consider myself an environmentalist. I think that most people at their root want clean air and clean water and a good environment, and they have a feeling that they should leave the place to their children and their grandchildren better than they found it. But the environmental industry has really taken a hold of North America, and I would suggest Alberta and the oil sands, and made it a symbol. And pipelines made them a symbol. And the neat thing about our jurisdictions is that you can protest relatively easily. You don't have to be worried about getting shot doing it. You know, we're pretty genteel about it. And so, you know, when I talked about our regulatory environment and our difficulty in getting pipelines to the coast, on the west coast of Canada, there's a lot stronger environmental movements, if I can put it that way. The First Nations issues are there, and it has made it impossible. No, not because the companies did it well. They didn't in terms of engagement. But it's made it impossible for them to move ahead with the agenda of getting a pipeline to the north coast. And in fact, our federal government has put a moratorium or a ban on tanker traffic to the North BC coast, which is where one of our best deep ports is, because of the concerns about the impact on the traditional economy for the First Nations in terms of fishing and the coastal waters and those sorts of things. Ironically, tankers can go into the Washington state area and through the Straits of Juan de Fuca into Vancouver on our side of the border, and huge traffics in there, and great issues with respect to the marine wildlife. But that's an issue. That's the political issue for us, is this balance on the environment, which I think we're all concerned about, the clean air and clean water, and how you disturb or how you create some balance while developing. But that's the play for us, and we are the poster child for the environmental movement, because we're so willing to, as we should be, willing to accept people making their views known and being, you know, the law is essentially not going to interfere with unless they're actually destroying property or doing something violent. So that's the political issue for us: is how do we deal with that and still have a relatively progressive regulatory framework which allows projects to move ahead.
Thank you.
I've got very little to add to the two very complete answers you've just gotten, but both Mr. Fee and the Premier outlined terrific reasons why modern technology and the free market system can solve issues caused by politics, but it doesn't work in reverse. Politics has many issues that they can cause if politics aren't managed, and that's why policy has to be done very carefully, and as I tried to argue in my remarks, has to be done with a broad view and not be limited to just a bilateral U.S. somebody else axis, which is a recipe for sub-optimization.
Thank you. Anything to add?
I want to let that stand. I thought that was a great stand.
All right. Let's take some questions from the audience. First question, given the abundance of carbon energy supply in the United States, will manufacturing be repatriated to the United States in the absence of reduction in labor costs?
I grew up in Pittsburgh. I would say no. The oft-repeated promise of returning steel to Pittsburgh, I was there when steel left. If it comes back, it's going to be done by robots. It's not going to be done in the old way of massive labor forces. This is happening elsewhere, too. In China, the low-end labor market is moving across Chinese borders to other countries. This is causing issues of domestic stability and employment there. It's a market-based thing. It's not something I don't think that can be willed to come back. On the other hand, free market is necessary. We had what we, the United States, advertised as the gold standard of trade agreements in the Trans-Pacific policy. But in my opinion, we did not sell that either internally or necessarily externally, publicly, as a trade agreement. We sold it as a foreign policy initiative. So therefore, the three dominant presidential candidates all took a virulently anti-trade argument going through the campaign. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the United States dropped out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was not trade that caused the loss of jobs in the Rust Belt. It was automation, and nobody really addressed that. And until we start addressing things both internally as well as externally in a more candid way, and we start talking about real solutions, not repatriating jobs that went away with the demise of manual labor in steel mills, but start talking about how to better equip our young people to handle the world that we're in instead of the world we wish we still had. We're not going to be able to repatriate employment, let alone repatriate specific jobs.
Yeah, I would like to add, but caveat, I think I agree with General Gregson that I don't think it's going to have necessarily a huge impact on jobs because of the automation issue, but I do think it is already repatriating industry, especially those industries that produce almost directly from petrochemicals or high energy consumption industries, specifically polymers and pharmaceuticals. A good chunk of both of those that had grown up in Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall, because you had low-paid engineers with access to Russian natural gas. A lot of those industries have, because of the rise of the coercion of the Russians and the rise of cheap energy in the middle of the country. Bulgaria recently said that 37% of their pharmaceutical production had moved to somewhere like between Nebraska and Minnesota because the energy was cheaper. And but I don't think that brought hundreds of thousands of jobs. I think it brought industry back to the country, not necessarily a lot of jobs.
I'd agree with both of those perspectives, but I'd say this, that a low energy input cost is helpful to the diversification of the economy in any event, that it adds, we're not, the manual jobs are going to be automated in any event, but the pharmaceuticals, the plastics, the other industries that come off it will happen here if we can have lower input costs. And we're not going to lower the cost of labor. That's going to be difficult and probably not advisable, because people need to be able to have, dare I say, a living wage. They've got to be able to pay for their food and their shelter. So it's not a question of trying to drive the cost of labor down. But if we want more activity, it starts with having lower input costs, and energy is at the core of that. So, and the other piece is that we don't focus so much on, as I was saying, on diversification and on the other things we can do when we're fully deployed shipping energy, because it's high cost. And so, particularly in our economy, in years in government that I was there, arguing that we needed to even diversify in the energy industry to get into the plastics and upstream pieces, and they were saying, why would you move from an area where you're getting a very high margin and you're fully deployed, ripping and shipping? Why would you aspire to change that for a lower and more risky return? Well, the lower energy cost, notwithstanding the immediate shock in our economy, does allow us to really think about the diversification. And it's not going to bring the high input, high human input manufacturing jobs back, but it is going to allow us to diversify into the higher cost commodity market.
Anything else to add? The next question from the audience is, what is the role of climate change environment policy in emerging fossil fuel abundance?
I mean, I'll just reiterate something I said earlier, that I think, you're seeing, there's 191 countries that are a party to the Paris Agreement. That for now includes the United States. The other two countries, Syria and Nicaragua, are the other two countries that are not parties to it. Nicaragua has said that they are going to join the Paris Agreement, which is non-binding. So you have a global, movement, I think, towards individuals and countries making choices to have a cleaner environment. And in terms of fossil fuels, there will continue to be a role for fossil fuels for a long time. 70% of oil consumption is transportation. That's not going away for a long time, even if you increase EVs just because of replacement costs. So there's no silver bullet on energy and climate issues and kind of what the next source of energy is. I think we should continue to invest in kind of new R&D. We don't know what's going to come next. Kind of similar to, a lot of people didn't know that the shale gas revolution was coming. But we can certainly, decrease energy poverty and do so in a way that preserves the environment and decreases carbon emissions.
Thank you very much.
I think that the reality is that the other side of it is that it's driven innovation. If you take a look again, use oil sands as an example, they've reduced the emissions by over 50% per barrel. It's even higher than that. I don't know what the exact number is. Our overall emissions have gone up because production's gone up, but on a production basis, everybody's focused on how they can do it cleaner, and on what they can do to extract more. Use again the tailings that come out of a surface mine. There's technology now that can get you more barrels of oil that used to go into the emissions, right? And that's valuable when your sale cost is only $50. When it's $100, you want to produce at the other end. But when it's $50, you want to get as much as you can. The heavy metals that are in the tailings. So they're looking for other pieces. So that climate change and environmental push is actually driving companies to do things more effectively and more efficiently. That's good for us, I would argue. It creates a higher end economy because they need people who are innovators and are thinkers and who are inventing things and who are looking at solving those problems on the one side, so improving production, and creating new products on the other side to as you say, what are we going to do with our oil if nobody's driving gas-driven cars sometime down the future?
Thank you very much indeed. I think we have time for 2 more questions, and please feel free after the conference, if your question was not asked, feel free to approach the panelists. Next question, from an international perspective, what role will America's leadership have on the global markets and the impacts of those relationships? Anyone?
You want to pick us?
What impact would U.S. leadership have? It remains to be determined. We're going to have an impact. I would argue that we're or should be, the champion of free trade, free market, human rights, and those things, all of which are designed to support peace, stability, and prosperity in many places. We championed China's accession to the WTO in late 90s, early 2000s, based on the principle that a very self-serving principle, number one, in that dealing with a happy, contented China is going to be a heck of a lot easier for us than dealing with an angry China. Number two, that what's good for China can be good for American business. From the voyage of the Empress of China in, I think, 1784 until now, we've championed free access to Asia and the Chinese market. I think, personal opinion, that U.S. leadership needs to be less cautious about espousing what we think of as traditional American ideals and more of an advocate so that we can help things come out well and eliminate or at least tamp down the effect of some of the more pernicious elements of international politics that we face, not only in the area that I was talking about, but many other areas around the world. It's not going to run on autopilot, and it's not going to run on a isolationist basis. It's got to be an international free market, and we're the only ones that can espouse that.
I would agree with the general, but I would add, we're going to have a dramatic change to a trend line that's been going at least since January 20th of 2009, which is and has continued now into this administration, but with a different, a little bit of a different angle at it, which the previous administration really believed that international regimes were going to provide the common good of security. And without the underlying imperative to the U.S. economy of maintaining security of energy, that didn't work without U.S. leadership and being willing to pay the cost of that global good of security. And now with an America First approach, which is looking at everything transactionally, based solely on interest, there's no desire necessarily to provide that global good of security. So what does that mean? I think we're going to have a hell of a lot more conflict and wars, and we will be, as a result of that, for a long period of time, dependent on oil, even more than natural gas, because it's easy to pump, and we've got a lot of it. And so it's going to retard the energy market where it would go, which is a gradual move towards LNG and renewables. But that's going to take the U.S. being willing to lead and pay that extra cost of the global good. And I'm just not seeing an inclination left or right to do that. And it would take a dramatic change in attitudes, I think, for that to happen.
Thank you very much indeed. And our last question is for the Premier of Alberta, but it's also open to everyone on the panel. Can you predict the fate of Venezuela's oil if and when Maduro's government falls? Who gets it? How fast? What will the competition look like? No pressure.
I want to write this down and see my bookie afterwards.
Short answer is no. I don't think anybody can really predict what's going to happen in Venezuela. I mean, presumably at some point in time, reason will out, and Venezuelan oil will again be a supplier. But at that stage, they may well be in a position that some would argue Canada's in, and that is we've fallen behind in our market development because of what's happened internally. There's for instability reasons, and us because we're moribund with our regulatory frameworks and our processes. But the bottom line is, if you miss the market, Chenier is going to build all the LNG plants and be exporting to the world, and then who's going to invest in a $8 billion plant in Venezuela? Or I mean, that's the reality, is that they lose a step in an abundant supply market. I don't see them really coming back to play in that in a major way, depending on how long they're out of it.
Would anyone like to add anything else? Well, if not, I want to give a big round of applause to our terrific panelists, all of our speakers today. Our panelists, our keynote speakers, thank you very much. And thank you all for attending, and thank you to the Daniel Morgan Graduate School for hosting this terrific event. Please, yes. Thank you very much.
Technically live in Houston, but I spend most of my time up here.
I got it. You survived the first hurricane of the year, apparently.
Yeah, I was up here, thankfully, but my car didn't survive. Thank you for your supper roast, for sure.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks so much. This was great. Appreciate it.
Nice to meet you.
Had a good
Terrific talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I had a good friend working down there for a while in Houston.
Great job you set us up.
Lots of space going for it. So,
He moved to Tampa.